live on Facebook. We're just waiting for our second reader of the evening to join us. She's joining us from Montreal, so, and with the time change and everything, sometimes these time differences can be confusing. Okay, just give her a little bit more time. We can always, we are live, and this recording will go up on our Facebook page, but we can always edit out sections of it. So we won't necessarily, if you want to chat amongst yourselves, won't necessarily be documented for posterity. We can cut it out. I'll just give a couple more minutes before we begin. All right, we will get started. In just a couple minutes. So give us a few, just give us a second. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Yanni Kroltz, and we will get started with our Flywheel reading this evening. Sarah's going to be joining us a little bit later if everything goes well. So we're going to get started with Marcello Di Cintio's reading. But first I have a few words this evening. So thank you for joining us. We are streaming live to Facebook, and of course we're here on Zoom. I want to give a little shout out to my partner, Michael. He is doing all the behind the scenes work, doing all the tech stuff, which is infinitely helpful. We have one more virtual reading planned for 2021 next month. I'll tell you a little bit about it at the end of the evening, so stay tuned. And I want to thank pages are host during non-pandemic times. You can purchase both authors' books there. They have extra copies for you to grab. Christmas, Hanukkah is coming up, so always a good thing to support your local bookstore. And if you're not in Calgary, of course, I encourage you to go to your local bookstore and support them. They do so much for literature across Canada. Also, a huge thank you to our partner and funder, Filling Station Magazine. They support this reading series. You can find them at fillingstation.ca. Subscribe. You get 3 fantastic magazines a year, and you can also submit. Their current call is for their issue on play, and they're accepting submissions until February 15th, 2022. Also, if you are on Facebook, please like our page, Flywheel Reading Series. You can also see us on Instagram or catch us on Instagram at Flywheel Reading Series, and share our video on Facebook and such. Before we begin with Marcello's reading, I want to say that while we are meeting virtually, for those of us here in Mohkinstsis, we would like to acknowledge the traditional territories and oral practices of the Blackfoot Nations, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai. We also acknowledge the Sarsi Dene of Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda of Morley, which includes Bearspaw, Chiniki, Wesley Nakota First Nations, the Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. All right, so we're really excited to have Marcello with us this evening. Marcello Di Cintio is the award-winning author of 5 books, including Walls, Travels Along the Barricades, and Pay No Heed to the Rockets, Palestine in the Present Tense, both recipients of the W.O. Mitchell City of Calgary Book Prize. Di Cintio's magazine writing has appeared in publications such as the International New York Times, Chatelaine, The Walrus, Canadian Geographic, and Afar. Di Cintio has served as a writer-in-residence at the Calgary Public Library, the University of Calgary, and the Palestine Writing Workshop. Di Cintio's newest book is Driven: The Secret Lives of Taxi Drivers. Please welcome Marcello Di Cintio.
Hello, Yanni, thanks for having me. Thanks to everyone who stopped in to listen. Before I start, I just realized that the office chair that I'm sitting in is all of a sudden sinking every now and again. So if I shrink, you know that's what's going on, and that will be embarrassing. I'm not a big guy as it is. I'm going to read a couple of short sections from my new book about the secret lives of taxi drivers. Because it's Remembrance Day today. I was thinking about how many of the taxi drivers that I profile in this book have had lives that are intersected with war. I mean, none of them are veterans, Canadian war veterans, but I've got, there's one driver in the book who was a Holocaust survivor, another driver in the book who lost his wife and child in the Somali Civil War, and another who lost his leg in Sierra Leone when rebels attacked his village. There's almost, I think at least half of the drivers in the book have some sort of intersection with war, whether as a combatant or as a victim or as both. But the soldier in the book that is probably the character that the driver that I most is my favorite driver in the book. I'm going to read a little bit from his section. His name is Mo Jalil, and I've nicknamed him the Bully of Baghdad. And I'll just read a bit from his section. The Iraqi army drafted Mo after his 18th birthday in 1986. He showed up late for his draft date, and his superiors punished him by making him run, do squats, and crawl in the mud. Officers locked all the new recruits into their barracks on that first night. They handed us 2 buckets, one for piss and one for shit, Mo said. In the morning, everyone was marched onto a bus. None of the new soldiers knew where they were going. The bus drove for 3 hours before stopping on the highway, where officers divided the soldiers into 3 groups and ordered them onto military trucks. All 3 trucks drove off the highway and towards the Iranian border. There were some palm trees. They were burned and chopped, Mo remembers. We started to hear some bombing, and then we were in the middle of it. The soldiers climbed out of the trucks and lined up in front of a colonel for their assignments. Mo was sent to the 1st unit. The colonel signaled me out because I was the biggest and because I had the biggest mustache, he said. It was a fashion at the time. Another officer handed Mo a chemical mask he didn't know how to use, an AK-47 he'd never fired, and ammunition he didn't know how to load. He didn't even know how to salute properly. The officer then pointed to a trench and told Mo to follow it. At 6'3", Mo stood taller than the trench was deep, and his head and shoulders were exposed as he walked. He followed the trench for 2 kilometers until he reached some other soldiers. Then I started to hear bees, Mo said. They were going by me, buzzing above me, behind me, in front of me. A soldier shouted at Mo to get down. Those bees were not bees, Mo said. They were bullets. If that sniper was any good, I would have been dead. That was my 2nd day in the military. Mo's unit occupied a valley between an Iraqi-occupied hill and an Iranian-occupied mountain. Hundreds of landmines seeded the no man's land just beyond the barbed wire coils edging Mo's trench. Tripwires were rigged to ignite buried drums of napalm or to detonate vicious bounding mines that jumped a meter into the air before exploding. The area was so dangerous and so isolated that Mo's superiors considered his unit expendable. Every night, we were recorded as losses, Mo said. In the morning, they would count us and put us back in. The soldiers fighting in Mo's unit came from all over Iraq, including small villages in the far reaches of the country. Mo's urban middle-class upbringing meant he'd never been exposed to rural Iraqis before. I had culture shock, he said. He met Iraqis with strange rural names, Arabic equivalents to Cletus and Billy Bob, Mo said. They were far more superstitious and religious than the Baghdadis he grew up with. Many wouldn't spend any of their army stipend before offering the money to their village imam back home, as required by their Shiite faith. Mo equated their religious devotion with gullibility and naivete. They're true believers in that bullshit, Mo said. He spoke with patronizing affection. Deep inside, I sympathize with them because they didn't know any better. They live in marshes. They raise water buffalo. They fuck mules, Mo said, but they're just pure, nice people. Still, none of this mattered in the trenches. The Iranian bombs didn't distinguish rural from urban, rich from poor, believer from skeptic. Everybody cared for everybody. Everybody hurt when someone was lost, Mo said. The horrors of trench warfare, unseen since the First World War, united them. So did death. Mo saw dead bodies for the first time when an officer ordered him to empty the pockets of 2 killed Iraqi soldiers who lay in the back of a truck. That will scar you, he said, no matter how much you say you're tough. Mo once came close to being killed himself. He'd recently returned from home leave and was handing out cookies to his fellow soldiers. When you come back, you don't come empty-handed, he said. Your buddies have been sitting for a month eating army food. You bring them a treat. It was Mo's night to fetch water for the camp. But since he was busy divvying out baked goods, one of the other soldiers offered to take his turn fetching water. He never returned. The soldier was hit with an Iranian 60-millimeter mortar shell 3 minutes after he left Mo's tent. You can hear the 80-millimeter shells coming. You can hear the 120-millimeter shells coming, but you don't hear the 60-millimeter coming, Mo said. That was supposed to be me. That was my turn. Mo's unit faced nearly constant bombing from Iranian positions, and soldiers learned that a particularly heavy day of bombing signaled a nighttime ground assault. The Iranians used to throw waves of people at us, Mo said, those gullible rural people. When the Iranian infantry advanced, Mo blindly fired his rifle over his head and above the top of the trench. He occasionally hurled a grenade if he felt the enemy was getting close. You peek every now and again, he said. You don't have time to think. All you have to know is that you're shooting, and shooting until you're done shooting. People often ask Mo if he killed anyone. Yes, I did. But it's not like in the movies. It's not like Brad Pitt shooting at the Germans, Mo said. There's no background music, nothing in slow motion, nothing in black and white. I have no words for it. Only chaos, survival, adrenaline. Despite this chaos, Mo claims he never felt afraid during the war. The bombs and constant threat of death became part of his daily life, as mundane as making tea and smoking cigarettes. A night without bombing was so rare as to be disconcerting. When it was quiet, we'd yell at the Iranians, "Come on, guys, send us a couple of bombs so we can sleep." I became something different than I was before. What did you become? I asked. I became a bit of an animal. So that's a little bit of war with Mo Jalil in Iraq and Iran. And I'm going to read a really short second piece. If the first one is about war, this one's about the opposite. Loneliness has followed me my whole life, everywhere, says Travis Bickle, Robert De Niro's iconic anti-hero in Taxi Driver. In bars, in cars, sidewalks, stores, everywhere, there's no escape. I'm God's lonely man. Though a taxi driver will serve dozens of people over the course of a shift, driving cab remains a fundamentally solitary occupation. A cabbie interacts with many, but truly engages with few. And the punishing hours and low status nature of the job rarely abets romance. In this way, the taxi is another kind of border, the border between seclusion and connection. But solitude hardly defined all the drivers I met, despite the lonely hours they had in common. Outside their taxis, their lives intertwined with the people they loved. These cabbies were hardly God's lonely men, and some weren't men at all. I first heard of Jas Houthi when my friend Megan sent a text from Jas's back seat. Do you want Calgary's only night shift lady cab driver's contact info? God, yes, I replied. Megan sent a phone number along with a photo of a startled-looking cabbie wearing a navy blue blazer, glancing behind over her shoulder from the driver's seat. Another message followed. She is amazing. Jas was wearing the same blazer, her checker cab uniform, and a pair of black-rimmed glasses when we met a few weeks later at a downtown Tim Hortons. She told me she grew up in India's Punjab province alongside two big brothers. Her father granted her the same independence he allowed his two sons. My father treated me like a boy, she told me. He never said, don't do that. He only said, go ahead. When Jas's brothers followed their father to the East Coast, Jas became a swimmer for the Indian national team and the All India University team. She specialized in breaststroke, but competed in multiple disciplines. I played water polo even, she said. Jas completed a Bachelor of Arts, then earned a diploma as a swimming coach. She eventually landed a coaching job with the National Institute of Sports in the Punjab. I thought of Andy Reddy, another breaststroke specialist, and wondered who would win a race between the two of them. In 1995, the Punjabi Canadian man whom Jas's parents had arranged for her to marry arrived in India from Edmonton. We met on Monday, got married on Wednesday. He went back to Canada on Saturday, Jas said. He didn't have any interest in India. Jas waited in India for 2 years until her Canadian passport came through, then boarded a plane to Edmonton. Her husband did not meet her at the airport. When she took a taxi to his house, he told Jas he didn't want to be married to her anymore. He told me, where you want to go, you can go. I don't mind. Jas asked him why he married her in the first place. The man shrugged and said his mother wanted him to marry an Indian girl. Jas left the house and stood outside on the sidewalk with her suitcase in the chill of Edmonton's early spring. At the time, I don't know where I am going, she said. I have no family in Edmonton, no friends. I don't even have a jacket. Eventually, out of suspicion or concern, a neighbor called the police. An officer in a cruiser pulled up in front of Jas and asked her something, but she couldn't understand. No English, she said. The officer asked for an Indian colleague who could speak to Jas. After she explained her situation to him, he asked if she knew anyone at all in Edmonton. The only person Jas had met was her Punjabi seatmate, who sat next to her on the flight from Delhi. They chatted during the journey, and she'd given Jas her phone number. The police officer called the woman and told her about Jas's predicament. The woman then told her uncle, who offered Jas a place to stay. Her uncle said, "Don't worry, bring her home." So she picked me up and took me to her house. From the kind stranger's house in Edmonton, Jas called her father at his police station in Punjab. She tearfully told him her Canadian husband had abandoned her and that she wanted to come home. A young police inspector named Amrit had been standing nearby, eavesdropping on the conversation. As Jas's father tried to console her, Amrit tapped him on the shoulder. "I would like to speak with your daughter," he said. Jas's father was confused. "Why?" "Because I am in love with her." I'll leave that there.
Thank you very much, Marcello.
Thank you.
I'm glad you read Jas's story.
I love Jas.
She's one of my favorites in your book. So I wanted to ask you why taxi drivers? And you make a point in your book about you weren't interested in the stories of driving taxi, but in the taxi drivers' stories of their lives. Why this particular population?
It's a really good question because, I'm sure I could have found the same incredible life stories from the people who bag my groceries or the people who serve coffee at Tim Hortons. In fact, Jas, before she starts driving cab, actually works at Tim Hortons. That's where she learned English. Is from the Tim Hortons menu. So there's people with stories all around us, but there's something unique about the kind of the environment of the cab. I find, I can't think of another place where two strangers can be in such close proximity to one another for so long and exchange so little, right? It's almost a natural place. Yeah, we can order a coffee from the Tim Hortons, but we don't spend that much time in physical space with the people who serve us our coffee or check out our groceries at the grocery store. So it's kind of this bizarre place where so little is exchanged. I'm as guilty as anyone else for jumping in the backseat of a cab, blurting out a destination and then staring at my phone until I get to the place where I need to be. So I was really wondering what I was missing from my backseat position, right? What was going on? Who was the man? It's most usually a man, but who are the men and women who I only know kind of through the reflection of their eyes in the rearview mirror? I'd spent my entire career, all my other books involved me traveling around the world to far-flung places and finding the stories of fascinating people. I didn't need to go elsewhere in the world. Those kind of stories surround us, and a lot of them are in the front seat of those cabs.
You said at the beginning of your book as well that you weren't a fan of taxis so much, but your impression, that sentiment changes by the end. You speak a little bit about your affection for the people you've met. Does that extend to all taxi drivers now? Or I know that we're in the middle of a pandemic, so maybe you haven't taken many taxis recently, but why that shift? You said it much kinder than I did. I mean, the first line of this book is, "I hate taking cabs. I hate taking taxis." And that comes from what I said before about, my previous work has been me traveling around the world and often to places where taking a taxi involves, a negotiation at best and a heated argument at worst, right? Places I spent a lot of time in Western and Northern Africa and in the Middle East and in India, where
every ride is a debate. You know, there's the meters are either non-existent or conveniently broken, so there's a fight. And so, and I mean, literally, I've almost come to fisticuffs with cab drivers over the course of my career because, I mean, thankfully I didn't. I'm not a big guy. I would have lost all those fights had they actually come to blows. But I kind of came back from those trips with this kind of ingrained anxiety. I call it the post-taxi stress disorder. So that even in places like here in Calgary, where the meters work and I know I won't be cheated, I feel this kind of this lingering anxiety about taking cab. Now, do I love taking cabs now? No, I don't love that. I'm a walker and I'm a public transit guy. But I think over the course of spending kind of 2 years amongst, or about a year with the drivers around Canada and hearing their stories, I have an affection for the drivers as the work that they do. But more than that, it's kind of the stories that they represent, and just knowing that the guy in the front seat likely has lived a remarkable life. Whether or not he wants to share it with me or not, whether or not I even ask. And I mean, God forbid people read my book and then interrogate their cabbies every time they get into the back seats. I would, that I'm sure that the drivers do not want this. But it's enough for me just to know that those stories are there, that we're surrounded by it. And stories that are so entirely unexpected. I wrote at the beginning of the book how every time I mentioned to someone I was writing a book about the lives of taxi drivers, they said, "Oh, how many brain surgeons have you met driving cab?" Right? That's kind of the urban cliche, is that you have your driver has professional education from some faraway place, comes to Canada. Those credentials are not recognized. So instead of performing surgery on brains or working as an engineer or as a pharmacist, they're driving cab. In fact, there's a joke in Quebec. That is, where are you least likely to die of a heart attack? In a cab, because chances are your driver's a cardiologist. And so, but we know those stories, right? Like that I mean, or at least we can imagine them. It's kind of an urban, if not an urban myth, it's an urban cliche. And so what I was so excited to find is the stories that I was told by drivers were so much more interesting and unexpected than just the cabbie cardiologist stories. These are men and women who lived remarkable lives that were always surprising and fascinating. And that makes me it just makes me happy to know that we're always surrounded by people who've lived those sorts of lives. Everyone's gone through their shit, and it's that there's something very comforting about that.
Yeah, you mentioned too that it's not a defeat to drive a cab. Like there's something maybe not noble, like doing this job, supporting a family through this work. It's not like it's a loss necessarily.
No, I talk about, one chapter is about the novelist Rawi Hodge, a Montreal author, drove cab in Montreal for a little while before he became a Impact Dublin Award-winning novelist. Like he wrote De Niro's Game while driving cab in Montreal. Like it's a remarkable story. And when that book became like an international hit, and he became a celebrated author, he remains so. He told me he was kind of amused that journalists would refer to him as the immigrant who made it. And there's something intensely condescending about that. It's like an immigrant makes it when he or she stops doing the things that immigrants are supposed to do, i.e. driving cab. So Rawi made it because he's doing something that he's exalted into the kind of the can lit stardom, and he's no longer doing immigrant work, like pushing cab, right? But if I look at a lot of the drivers that I met and got to know writing this book, haven't they made it? Jas and Amrit, who I just read about, they worked incredibly hard in Calgary for many years, bought a house, raised their kids, brought their parents to Calgary from India. They all lived 3 generations live in this giant house. Paid for their kids' education. Haven't they made it? Haven't hasn't Michael Kamara, who lost his leg in Sierra Leone, and who's now a leader in the Sierra Leonean community in Halifax, and who sends money and soccer equipment and jerseys back to the soccer teams in Freetown. Hasn't he made it? Yeah, he works hard, and no one's inviting him to gala events. He's not gonna. He's nominated for the Giller Prize, but he's made it he's made it. He's been successful. His kids are safe and educated, and all the things that they weren't when he was that age, right? I don't even remember your original question, Yanni, but I hope I answered it.
You did very much. Yeah. I have more questions for you, Marcello, but we are joined by the lovely Sarah Burgoyne from Montreal. I would argue actually a city of questionable, maybe not all of them, but taxi drivers. I've had some interesting in taxis there. Anyhow, really happy to have Sarah here. And I'm going to introduce her and then we'll return to questions shortly. Okay, so Sarah Burgoyne is an experimental poet. Her second collection, Because the Sun, which thinks with and against Camus' extensive notebooks and the iconic outlaw film Thelma and Louise, was published with Coach House Books in April 2021 and is currently nominated for the A.M. Klein Prize in Poetry. Her first collection, Saint Twin, published by Mansfield Press in 2016, was also a finalist for the A.M. Klein Prize in Poetry, awarded a prize from l'Académie de la Vie Littéraire, and shortlisted for a Canadian Relit Award. Other works have appeared in journals across Canada and the US, have been featured in scores by American composer J.P. Mertz, and have appeared with or alongside the visual art of Susanna Barlow, Jamie McCauley, and Giovanni Tremblay. Please welcome Sarah Burgoyne.
Thank you so much for having me here, and I'm mortified that I came in late. I was telling Yanni that I have time zone dyslexia because I was going to show up at 4 p.m., which would have made me like 5 hours early, I guess. But instead I was like, oh, of course. So it's a 3-hour time difference. So I was ready to go and about now, but I got this frantic text being like, it's 2 hours, so I apologize. And I'm really sorry that I missed Marcello's reading. It sounds super interesting. And I was thinking, I just took a cab recently, and the driver was from Algeria, which is where Albert Camus is from. And we ended up having this long conversation about his travels and Camus and his book La Peste, I guess, or The Plague in English. And it was really rewarding and interesting. So yeah, I feel like a cab is such an interesting space because you're kind of stepping into a portal and you don't know what you're going to expect. And sometimes you have like this silent period where you're just staring out the window, and then other times you have these really enriching conversations with someone who you'll probably never encounter again. So yeah, it is wild. So I'm actually going to open because Camus has a lot to do with the book I just published, which is Because the Sun. Because the Sun is the reason, if you've read The Stranger or The Outsider, Meursault is like the notorious character who kind of is moving through his life without feeling very much, and he ends up shooting somebody on the beach because the sun is in his eyes, so he says. And when he's on trial, they're like, why did you shoot this man? He's like, oh, because the sun, or à cause du soleil. So I was so fascinated by the idea of like ambient violence, or like things that we absorb and then project onto others that have nothing to do with them. And the sun as sort of a metaphor for that. So I scoured Camus' notebooks for every instance that he referenced the sun, just in order to understand more Camus' own relationship with heat and the sun. So I found this amazing little bit of dialogue in those notebooks, and I used it as an epigraph, so I'm just going to read it here. Um, there's a note above it that said dialogue, and there's two characters. And what do you do in life? I count. What? I count. I say, 1 the sea, 2 the sky. Ah, how beautiful it is. 3 women, 4 flowers. Ah, how happy I am. And I was fixated with that. And obviously I'm terrible at counting, considering I can't count time zones. So maybe that's why I was drawn to it, the envy. So I'm just going to read a couple poems from the book. I'm going to start with one called What Was, and it's sort of after Arthur Rimbaud, a little bit mimicking his structure in his work. What was? This sun, murder grotto, dune among naked bodies, sky zero in my glass. Think through it, a babbling sound through my days. It flows around me, through the sun, then closer to me. Midnight nails its hour to the wall at the edge of the room, the dream plant in a pot of gold beside cups of ink, the plant's contraptions, the silence of the plant and its reaching and aging. The born moon, the figuring, the forgotten shirt. And soon I shall have this sound in me, and that sound. Here is the closed room behind the chrysanthemums, the dead little room and its mat of astroturf. The whole sky is luminous in the room, and the great obstacle is what has already taken place. Genius is this power of dying, her tragic love of life. You follow hello to the sound of a friend. The castle is now open. You may go inside. The women who have given themselves are hanged in unbelievable cruelty, surrounded by smells and rotting meat. Well, all has changed. The desert has come to you. Besides, there's nothing to see. The springs rise and dry. The sunny field is raised without apologies. The weathercock, crosswinds, and wingspans form an isthmus to the sun, the field's headdress. The gold steeple of the desert stretches its arms to the curbs of your street and needles flowers through your window. The talking stones were pissed and murmuring. The astroturf was growing. Zeros were asking no questions as stages on the way to unrewarded perfection. In the room there is a creak. Its sound stops you and makes you quiet. There is a repetition. There is a sound of a fountain that is just a sound. There is a fitted sheet and a gold frame. There is a patterned glass and there is water in the glass. There is a blue ink pot and an amber ink pot. There is a disappearance, the sun. There is a repetition. I am the player on the pond, figuring a move as this year lasts longer than the last. I am the right structure for the beam of this sun, its drunken laundry setting. I am the space the cracking sound took. I am opening the moment. Someday I'll be the length of the shadow of the tree's sad hand. It's harder to cross here, but when you do, you walk to a narrowing point. It's beautiful if you look at it across the music. I pay with time because it's precious to me, and the pattern round the glass is red and permanent. I turn the plant every hour so it grows right. I know the spaces sound between the words. I close off the room because it is better to say nothing and pay attention to everything else. 3 cats and 2 dogs, their inner melodies. At dusk, the angles stack up against the wall. Each is a lineup of art. what it would look like to orchestrate a late dying, already half skeletal, and the work you got done. The next poem I'm going to read, I wrote to sort of, I don't know how many of you know this writing rule, which is like to annihilate gerunds in your writing. So any ing, like people will say, like if you have too many ings, it sounds really sing-songy and annoying. And anyway, I just thought I'm just gonna put ings everywhere because I like that. So this is a short poem. It's called "The Purpling Night is the Trees Heavy with Darking." Is my shelving of its book there on my shelf, as the dog calls in the field, thick with the sky's bidding? Perch me back on my table with my newing, my precious newing. Aloof moon, leave me be. How I got so comfortable with a sleepy passing car to marry my fearing, riding round the gazebo. My nighting is the waves of sound in the distance, my fonding of fear. O communicator, it hangs like a wet heat, my limping dog on my table, so comfortable with it, my blooding filling my body with heat, wristing night's folds in the pages. The trees electricing with sundown, a stone building fortifies against the shimmering, which is the unworried night sky pestling me to sugar, my anointing complete. The benches are waiting for it, not differenting my sorrowed lungs, empty of performance and the clouding, pinking, bluing, lighting, leaving. So I'm gonna read a little bit of something new that I'm working on now, which is a choose your own adventure poem. I don't know if you remember those stories from childhood. I have no idea when anyone was a child. But it involves maybe a little bit of participation just in the chat. So I'm going to ask you some questions about what to do. And whoever just types first in the chat, I'll just follow their direction. Or not, I'll just make it up if people are feeling chill and not wanting to participate. So yeah, probably won't be able to get through it all, but I'm going to give it a start. I can't call it Choose Your Own Adventure because I think I'll get sued. So if anyone has a good title, I'm looking for one. The green room is the reliable witnesser. The green room wants to be pink, a mirage painting everything as ruffle. You buy your bedspread in limitless pink, and so green paints the ceiling and the plywood closet the pink of a vigorous narrative. If you choose to continue the narrative, go to line 16. If you choose to lay down in the limitless pink bed and enter the island of sleep, go to line 103. So if anyone wants to type either 16 or 103, I'll watch the chat. If not, I'll just, okay, 16. And yet, the nylon curtains absorb so much nothing. Open the question of spoil when left shut. The plants, you see, are supposed to grow, to acquire light and therefore shift into Baroque symbols of hope and christening air. If you choose to open the question of spoil, go to line 103. If you choose to water the plants, go to line 32. This will be a telling one. Okay, the question of spoil is being opened. The heat cracks like an egg over your island. Plants grope for abundance, but suffer in the dark room. The monstera prays and meanders, mewling, "What shall I cry?" This island is a soup, and to think, to lie here in this island's own time, can only melt you into several possible ends. If ending is impossible, go to line 140. If you believe you are reading a dream's letter, go to line 116. If you would like to wake up, go to line 1. That's a surprising one, because that takes us back to the beginning. So I'm going to hack the system, and I'm going to continue the letter. The letter continues. As a child, I read Choose Your Own Adventure stories, but only the pages where I die. As a child, I died 47 times, and death was thrilling, like all things. To make myself ornate, I'd drop an orange slice into my Coke. To tame the morning, I'd pen mad letters, which asked mad things like, will you choose to inherit the night or day? If you pick day, turn to line 1 once, or 26,645 times. If you pick night, don't move, just lie there and read on. About life expectancy. First imagine purple horizontal flowers elbowing their way into dusk out your bedroom window. Lightning strikes to animate you, and you hit your head on the bed frame and you drop your hat into a field of wildflowers. The fridge opens to show you a row of unbroken eggs in perfect egg brown. Your life is now an exit text. On the porch you can see it, your life, exiting as the purple flowers exit your vision when night falls. Not as lightning exits a cloud or blackened foot. You want to go back inside, so you do. On the top of the bookshelf, a globe sits very still. You pull it down to look directly into the face of the Atlantic Ocean, and you wonder if it thinks of itself like that, in all caps. The last part of the story is the oceans alone, in an ancient glass dish set in silver, passed down by the ocean's grandmother's grandmother, are a pair of dollar store earrings, and this can be what it's like to be a poet today. But in the clay box, with a little lion on the front, that the ocean's sister made for it in high school, is a poem. It has been folded twice and tucked away, called Nothing Has Been Lost. And I think I'll end it there.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I have to say the time problem was not Sarah's alone. I was definitely party to it. I read all of her emails and was like, that makes sense. Yeah, you'll see it at 4:30 your time. Like, so it wasn't just you. You can't take responsibility for that.
No, I do. It happens all the time.
But yeah, like what is time even at this point in the pandemic or in life? I have to say I'm really interested in this next project of yours. Of Choose Your Own Adventure poetry. When I was a child, Choose Your Own Adventures caused me no end of anxiety. I would just like choose all of the, I would read all of the narratives at the same time and then confuse myself. But I'm looking forward to tackling Choose Your Own Adventure poetry in the near future. So I have a few questions for you about Because the Sun. I'm interested as I read in your, and as you said, this book is in conversation with or pushes against Camus and the book The Stranger or the Outsider. What was or what is your fascination with this text? Why does it hold?
Why does it what, sorry?
Why did it or why does it hold your interest?
Well, I was forced to read it in high school twice, in English and in French. And I just, I didn't like it. I didn't really, we were all kind of scandalized by Meursault's, lack of liveliness, for a better word. But every time the sun was directly in my eyes, I couldn't stop thinking about, that scene would come to my mind. And just it's a pretty intense experience when the sun is blinding you, right? And it usually, always, hopefully, our impulse is to kind of look away or try to figure something out. to shield our vision. But I'm noticing even now with the seasons changing, like when I'm biking to work, the sun is a lot lower, so it's like more directly, and there's like moments where I'm sort of blind, can't really see where I'm going. Um, but I was thinking about that a lot, I guess 5 years ago now, um, in Banff when where we were together. Um, when I was thinking a lot about just how, I guess a lot of information was coming out at that time. This was before the Me Too movement, but a lot of information was coming out at that time about people being harassed or, just getting sort of like um, a lot of like harassment, especially in the writing community, like emails, really. Like a lot of people were getting brutal emails that really kind of didn't seem that directed at them. You know what I mean? Like the way that I was thinking about it was how so often, we experience like hardship in our lives or strife, and we don't know what to do with it. So we sort of channel it and direct it at the closest target. And so in The Stranger, that happens in a literal way with the sun in his eyes and he can't stand it. Of course, it has to be more than that. But I was thinking about that just in terms of people's own life experiences and anger and how it gets taken out on whomever is closest, usually closest emotionally, you know. So yeah, just that process of absorbing something that's in the air and then channeling it on to someone else. And I guess I saw that a bit with the pandemic too, especially at the beginning. It seemed like there was just so much more like road rage and people yelling at each other in grocery stores. Like the tension was so high, you know? And it's like that person who wants the same carton of orange juice that you want is not your enemy. But like every emotion that that person is feeling at that moment gets like taken out on this total stranger. So yeah, that was my analogy. And then it also just, because I was at Banff when I started thinking about this, they have that little library, right? And the library just happened to have all of Camus' notebooks. And I was like, this is great. So I'm going to take them all out and just read them. So it was partially just circumstantial too. Like I just happened to be in a place where I had time and I had a whole bunch of notebooks. And yeah, I was kind of thinking about what the stories of a lot of the writers there were, like what the gossip was about people's lives. And it all kind of started to make it pattern to me. Yeah.
It came together as kind of magic.
Mm-hmm.
I reading this book, I mean, I've been reading it in a particular context and of the climate crisis, and I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit. The presence of the sun is very relentless, particularly in the first section of this book, and I found myself getting a little like, not parched, but I was like, wow, like this, you know, like it's very affecting, and it's kind of I had a visceral experience of it, and I started to think about. And then one of the things you write in your notes is the sun is a material symbol of pain and effective backlog. We're slung under, pushing us through desert after desert where we become deadly. And I'm just thinking about this in terms of the current climate crisis and that kind of relentlessness of heat. Like this past summer was the hottest summer ever, and the coolest one for the rest of our lives. Like this, you know, this is something that we're now maybe, well, we've been dealing with it for a while, but it's very much in my mind. Did you think of this at all, like while you were writing, gesturing towards this crisis, or is it something that I don't mean to be grasping at something, but it's just something that came to mind?
Yeah, oh, for sure. Like the solar eclipse happened while I was writing it, and my friend Paige and I, Paige, whom you know as well, sat out on my deck and watched the solar eclipse with those little glasses that you buy so you can look directly at the sun. But the sun seemed like, and then I started hearing about a lot of people writing about the sun all of a sudden, and Donald Trump staring into the sun. That's just like, oh my God, I can't write about the sun now. It's just too popular. Um, but yeah, it was definitely on my mind. Like I grew up in Vancouver, so I'm used to temperate weather, like the hottest it gets is like 25 and the coldest is like 0, and like it's just that little realm. So moving to Montreal, I felt like suddenly I was experiencing like heat and humidity in a way that I never had before. And kind of started getting in touch with the rest of the world and like how, it is like intensely brutal. Like there's something, and especially, yeah, the last couple years have been, I think they're starting to name heat waves in the same way they name hurricanes because they are deadly and they, take out a lot of people. And yeah, it's alarming. And I feel like what heat does to people too, it creates this sort of like drunken stupor almost, like it changes you more than cold does, I find. So yeah, and relentlessness was the word that I had in my head when I started thinking about the sun and just like the beaming of it into your eye and that kind of relentless like onslaught of light and heat. Of course, the sun is the reason we can live, but when it starts to kind of get a bit close or we're breaking down a layer and it gets a bit hotter, it becomes really like the murder grotto that I mentioned in the poem, like that kind of deadly force that you feel very, unless you have like air conditioning and a place to go or cool water to jump into, it's really, really hard to escape. Like heat waves are like sleepless for people if they don't have AC or something like that, But then, of course, with the AC, we're like, well, that's damaging to the environment too. So it's just going to make the sun hotter. And like, it's just this horrible cycle. But yeah, I wasn't like trying to write about climate, I guess. But I think it inevitably, when you write about the sun, you're going to be writing about climate.
Yeah, its presence is definitely, it's no longer like benign or even friendly. I was once driving through the Arizona desert in like May, and it occurred to me how dangerous it was, like just driving through if we were to break down, there weren't many cars, kind of the same way that driving through an ice storm or like a snowstorm is also really dangerous, but just in a different way. But yeah, definitely the elements are threatening.
Yeah, actually, I watched this film, Plan Soleil. They made an American version of it called Purple Noon. Do you know about this movie? It's like based on The Adventures of Mr. Ripley. I think that's what it's called. Okay. Patricia Highsmith. She wrote this book. But anyway, there's a moment where one of the characters, like falls asleep in a rowboat on the ocean, and he's just wearing his swim trunks, and there's no possible way for him to shield himself from the sun, and he's asleep, but he just gets like fried, and like that kind of like nowhere to hide is really scary, I think. And the sun, yeah, like it is really dangerous. It's a lot more dangerous than we think, because we think of it as something like happy and, oh, it's sunny, that's so wonderful, and a lot of times it is, but in those months in the summer it can be freaky. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and just experiencing the climate in different ways and experiencing oppressive heat, like in Calgary, which is a cold, like it's a cold place, it's a dry heat, and then it changes, and you're like, oh, this is new, this is different.
Yeah, for sure.
I want to, I have some questions for both of you, both you and Marcello, about the pandemic. And so I want to return to Marcello a little bit and just talk a little bit about your experience as a writer of nonfiction in the pandemic, I have a couple questions. And my first is actually going to be about the taxi drivers that you interviewed. As I was reading your book, I became increasingly anxious. This is a theme for me, anxiety. Anyway, I was like, what has happened to these taxi drivers? Like, this was written pre-pandemic. What is happening now to them? And you do give an update at the end of the book, but I mean, that was before it went to print. And I'm just wondering, have you stayed in touch with the writer, with the taxi drivers? Like, what I imagine that you have, maybe you can talk a little bit about this as well, like the relationship between writer and interviewee or subject. Like, how do you manage that? And how has the pandemic touched that for you?
Well, that's a great question, and the relationship between kind of subject and author is a huge topic. I could go on at length about. What was interesting in this particular case with the drivers, yeah, you know, I'd finished. It was very. I mean, it's the most obvious thing to say. It was so strange putting a book out in the middle of a pandemic. The book was in its what I thought was its final draft when everything went shut down, right? You know, and it ended up sitting. The book was supposed to come out 6 months earlier. It ended up sitting on my editor's desk for many extra months as he was trying to figure out what it meant to be a publisher, a bookstore owner, a father, like as the world is collapsing around us. And so it was late, and I was so grateful that, aside from the pandemic postscript, which I added, and I'll talk about in a second, that the book I was already in the final draft stage, because I don't know about you, Yanni, or Sarah, but I could not write during the pandemic. You talk about anxiety. Whatever creative impulse I had was completely tamped down by all this stuff I was worried about. So I could not have written. I could not have written new work in 2020. I don't think I could have. And I mean, not only was I not writing, I wasn't even reading. You know, like it was nothing. I was diving into the same old garbage television, and you know, I wasn't even consuming good art. I was watching Tiger King like everybody else. You know, like there was nothing. I couldn't grasp it. You know, things were too anxious. And that's not a way. You can't be an artist if you're consuming garbage. You know, just like there's no nutritional value there, right? It's like having a diet of Doritos. That does nothing for your body. And if you're subsisting on binging mediocre television, that's not going to help your writing. And that's how I felt for most of the pandemic. And I know that some of my colleagues as well felt the same way. Others didn't. I mean, Yanni, we were both friends with Ali Bryan, who like wrote like 2 books during the pandemic, and you just have to hate her for that. But I certainly couldn't do it. But what I did do, as you mentioned, is I couldn't leave the pandemic out of the book. You know, taxi drivers were like officially frontline workers. You know, they kept working during the pandemic. They had much less work to do especially as flights weren't coming in, people weren't traveling, there was no business traffic, all that kind of stuff. But they were still working. And so I followed up with about half of them and found out how they were doing, and I got those stories from them. So the only bit of writing I did during the pandemic was kind of after the spring when I got a sense of how COVID had been affecting the drivers. But I've kept in touch with a few of them, and I wish I could say I wish I had a better reason for that other than the fact, which is my publicist thought it'd be great to have drivers join me for these sorts of reading events, and so we wanted the drivers to be engaged with the book after it came out, which is something that I'd never done with my previous work ever. And so it happened a couple of times. I had a few events where on a Zoom call like this, where it was me and a couple other cabbies, talking about the book and their work and their lives and that sort of thing. So that was great. And so because of that, I got a sense of how they felt they were portrayed and all of these sorts of things. And as far as I know, everyone was pleased. I have this terrible habit, I think, as a nonfiction writer, in only writing about people that I like. Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's like, well, I fall in love with everyone I write about. Maybe it's that way. And so, even a guy like Mo, who I read about, I read a bit from his chapter, who was a kind of an arrogant prick, in a lot of ways. Getting to know him makes me care for him a lot, and I feel that way. I can't imagine writing. I can't imagine what reporters do. Kind of writing stories about shitty politicians every day. I couldn't do it. And I sure as hell not going to spend 30 pages and several hours with someone I don't like. And nor do I want my readers to. Like, I don't want to give you, 20 pages to spend with an irredeemable, villain. So maybe I only find people that I write about people I like. Maybe I like everyone that I write about. It's not a great habit, I'll admit, as a writer, certainly not as a journalist, to kind of to be on team source no matter who the subject is. But that's kind of the way I approach it. That's why I'm not doing parliamentary reporting.
Well, I think it comes across like Mo was a terrifying person. Like, I wouldn't necessarily, like, I wouldn't want to meet him. I thought, like, just from like the background and everything, but the way that you portray him is he's a human being, like I'm so that you portray his humanity. It doesn't come across as like any kind of fawning, adoration of him or anything like that. Like, but you respect him, and I think the reader respects him in turn, which is important, I think.
Mo's an interesting case because he's the cabbie that people either like the most or like the least. Women readers typically don't like him. But of all the people that I don't think of all the people I've ever met as a writer, I don't know anyone who's more like aware of their own failings and their own vanity and their own crimes as Mo was. Like Mo was his own biggest critic. He knew how vain he was. He knew his tendency towards violence. He called himself an asshole constantly in our conversations because he was one. Especially when he was a young jerk, bully in Iraq growing up. And it was funny. I was concerned about how he would react to his chapter in the book, right? Because I think, like I said, of all the drivers, he's the one that there's the most reason to dislike. I think that's safe to say, and he's also the one that I would want the least to upset. He's this 6'5" ex-wrestler soldier guy with a tendency towards violence. With a couple of assault charges on his record. I didn't need it to make an enemy out of Mo Jalil. He was the most thrilled with his portrayal. Like, he sent me, this long string of texts on how I really captured his true being, and all his friends read it and they said, yeah, that's Mo. And he was the one I was most worried about, and yet he was the most tickled by it, and I was both relieved and surprised by his response.
He's definitely a fascinating character or not a character, but a fascinating portrayal. So,
and I've seen some of these people before. Like, I went to Halifax on vacation with my son in August, and Michael Kamara picked us up from the airport. So I have these drivers on speed dial now, right? I don't know, and so Michael picked us up, and Amrit, Jass's husband Amrit, drove us to the airport in Calgary, and so I do, when I need a cab, these are the numbers that I'll call, and Jess won't drive me unless it's worth her while. She turned me down a couple of times. Like unless it's a long trip, Jess is not interested. It doesn't matter if I wrote a story about her or not. Like if it's an airport trip, sure, but I'm just going home from downtown, forget it. It's nice to have people, drivers that I know that I can catch up with, from the back seat. That's been fun the last little while.
Right. So taking a cab now takes on, of course, something different when you.
A little bit different, yeah.
So Sarah, I have a question. Marcello was saying that he had a difficult time with writing and even reading during the pandemic. How about for yourself? You're working on a new project. Is that born out of the pandemic, or was the pandemic fruitful for you? Does it take center stage in your writing at all these days?
It's a good question. I'll start with reading because I feel like that was like as soon as we had lockdown here, and we had like a curfew and like it was pretty intense for a while. Whenever I started to feel a little bit like, oh my gosh, what's going on? I'd just go and look at my bookshelves and I would just think like, okay, if I'm trapped in here with these things, it's going to be fine because I need to read them all anyways. And, I've been waiting for time to read. Like, I feel like my whole life is just everything I'm doing is just like postponing the reading that I want to do. So the reading was like, yeah, a lifesaver, I'd say, for me. I also had started teaching a poetry workshop that I call Poetry Studio, where it's like not like a traditional workshop. So everyone in it, we do like we read outside of our meetings, discuss for like an hour what we read, and then do like a spontaneous poetry experiment or a collaboration. And I am the facilitator of it, but I'm also participating in those experiments. So I was forced to write every single week because I'd, started this thing but one thing that I noticed in the Choose Your Own Adventure poem that I read, like I wrote a lot about the interior. So all of a sudden, like it was about the room, like the bedroom, or there was a poem about the mouse in the kitchen, or not about the mouse, but the mouse like made a big appearance in my life for a while. Probably because I would give it food, which I know you're not supposed to do, but he was just so cute. And I'm like, he deserves a good life, and a blueberry. So, yeah, or like I became really aware of like what creatures, like the place I live, it's 100 years old. So there's been creatures that have been living here for probably that amount of time. But like knowing like which birds live in which eaves, or which pigeons come and like land on the railing, like I started becoming able to recognize creatures that I probably wouldn't have even thought twice about, and even like obsessing over them a little bit because it was like they were like my roommates. Yeah, I would say that I did continue to write. I never wrote directly about the pandemic. Like I just felt it was too on the nose or something. I just didn't want to see the word. The word pandemic was like billowing all around me. I didn't want to like type it out or like see it on the page or be that on the nose with it. Also because there's no such thing as like a general experience of the pandemic, like I was one of the very lucky people who my job just migrated to online. I was safe, like I wasn't on the front lines. I wasn't driving cabs or, like I felt really, really fortunate. And so like the anxieties that I felt around the pandemic were so much about like family members who were like healthcare workers, or just like the kind of deep longing of like, oh, I wish I could see my dad, like who lives in Florida, like things that I just didn't really think about that much. So I didn't really feel like the pandemic was something for me to write about, I guess, because my pandemic was very mild compared to a lot of people But I did end up writing about the space that I was forced to inhabit very intimately for, a good long while.
And I've spoken to a number of writers who've had kind of a similar response, just in that, like, the pandemic, the response is, or the experience rather, is so particular. How do you write about the pandemic as a thing? I guess, but that's that's the response of like poets and novelists. But Marcello, you are a nonfiction writer. So how do you tackle the pandemic, or are you going to, or what is there to say about the pandemic? Like, how can you deal with it as a thing in the world?
It was interesting when I, as a nonfiction writer, I also write for magazines, and there was a point through much of the pandemic, there was a strange situation where every magazine that was still functioning was only publishing pandemic-related stories. But when you pitch them pandemic-related stories, they say we have enough pandemic-related stories. You know what I mean? So it was this weird sort of thing. So unless you had a fabulous new take or something that was happening that was suddenly news, like 100% newsworthy, it was tough. It was tough to kind of. It was all the same kind of noise, right? It was all the same kind of stuff. And now I think the pendulum has swung the other direction, where these same publications are like, please don't send us any more pandemic stories. We're done with it. Our readers are sick of it. Our editors are sick of it. But I'm not a news journalist. I know I wasn't reporting on stuff like that. How I approached it was I did a little bit of pandemic work, and I just approached it for stories that I thought hadn't been told. Like, I wrote a really like a puff piece for the CBC about brides having their weddings canceled and finding kind of solidarity on Facebook groups. And just because my sister's friend was going through this and passed the story on to me. Because I'd written about sex workers in Driven, and it's a topic that I've gone to a couple times. I wrote a piece about pandemic sex work, which was really remarkable talking to these workers and getting their sense of it. And I got divorced. I know my wife and I split, a week before lockdown. Thank goodness, a week before lockdown. And so I wrote about that. I wrote about this, and that for me was the most personal thing that I've written in an awfully long time, probably since I wrote about my child being born, was about this strange situation of suddenly separating and wanting to start a new life, but can't, because you're trapped in this. Well, you're trapped you're trapped in your house, and that's kind of the strangeness on how your own kind of personal discombobulation has just kind of merged with the general anxiety. How do you feel sorry for yourself, or when everyone is suffering in their own way at the same time? So that was kind of my approach to the pandemic was that it was kind of stories that either were personal to me, or that I felt that hadn't been told. But I understand Sarah's impulse 100%. I'm so tired of it. I don't want to write the word pandemic on the page anymore. I don't want to write the word COVID on the page anymore. I'd love to pretend, looking forward, when I do work now, I know what I'm working on now will not be published until that the pandemic will be over. And so it's this great relief that now when on this new book that I'm working on, which is about migrant workers, I don't have to ask them their COVID stories, because by the time that happens, it won't be the story everyone's talking about. So I'm very happy to be at the end of that. but it was a strange time to be a nonfiction writer because I think there was a lot of opportunities. There was a lot of new things to write about because the pandemic affected every aspect of everyone's life. But we all suffer from the same fatigue that Sarah mentioned too. Like I'm done. I'm done with it. And thankfully, so are editors and publishers and magazines too, I think.
What do you see, Sarah, I'll turn to you. You are working on this new project. What are you looking forward to? It could be with your writing or reading, or as things seem to be shifting kind of collectively, what do you look forward to?
It's a great question. With my writing, I'm actually, one thing that I've really embraced over the pandemic was collaborating and using like Google Docs as a way to collaborate with someone in real time, no matter where they are in the world. And so I've started a few like really exciting collaborations with different writers, and they're not just poetry. It's like I'm working on a collaborative novel with a friend, and we're already at like 50,000 words. You know, we're both poets, so it's like a whole new thing for us. I'm starting to think about, I started like interviewing people just because I got really interested in the form of interviewing because it's hard, you know, and you're really good at it, Yanni. But like, you know, it's like a skill that's like, it's, I always admire people who are strong interviewers, and I wanted to sort of figure out what that meant or like how to do that and like to listen and to direct a conversation. So I did a couple of those, and now, yeah, I'm kind of working on this choose your own adventure poem, which is really complicated and mathematically, as you could see in the reading. Like, you know, I cheated. I didn't go back to number one because I was like, we don't want to hear that again. But yeah, I obviously, because I can't understand time zones, really need to sharpen my math skills. So this will be a good opportunity for that. But yeah, I'm looking forward, I guess, in a nutshell, to exploring different genres and different like hybrid genres, and just seeing where collaboration, like the ones that I'm doing, where they go. Because the beauty of the collaboration is like the process is more of the product than the product, or the process is more valuable than the product. That's a less weird way of saying that. Like the friendships that are kind of growing out of these collaborations are so exciting and precious to me. And it's just such a cool way to interact with somebody, you know. It's a different type of energy. So yeah, I guess that's what I'm looking forward to for sure.
Well, that sounds really, really cool. And I feel like if you want any interviewing tips, Marcello would probably be the person to go to.
That's actually a really good idea.
So same question for you, Marcello. What are you looking forward to?
I'm looking forward to traveling again. I mean, as I mentioned before, you know, every other book except for this one has been me going to faraway places. This is the longest longest I've gone without kind of leaving Canada since the 90s. You know, it was so wild. I got to do a couple of in-person book festival events in the last month or so. And I was one was in Edmonton, right? You know, a 3-hour drive north to Edmonton, and I might as well have been in like Istanbul. I was so excited, and just to be out. Like I was excited to be on a bus. I was excited to be in a hotel room, in a restaurant dining by myself. You know, which is kind of what I always do when I'm on these big projects. So I can't wait to get back on a long flight somewhere. But really, I'm working on a book right now about migrant workers in Canada. So that book is not going to require international travel either. The same as the taxi book. It's going to be mostly, at least how I conceive of it right now. We're in the early stages, but it's going to be within our borders. But I am very excited to get out to elsewhere in the country to meet people. And I've only done very, very early stages, and I've just done a few interviews, and I was in Vancouver, and I met some people who said that they could connect me to people to interview via Zoom. I'm like, oh my God, no, like, this is the last thing I want to do. Like, if we're getting to the end, if we're getting to the end, and I don't even know if we are. Sometimes often I worry that we're not. The last thing I want to do is have Zoom interviews with subjects. Not anymore. So yeah, that's what I'm looking forward to. I'm looking forward to having an event like this in the bookstore and not sitting in my office again. And getting out and meeting people and meeting other writers and all of that sort of thing. Getting out of the house, in that global sense, and I miss that. I miss that a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's certainly a different energy that can't be replicated. Like being in a room with other people in particular moment in time. It's something that is that we've taken for granted, but is incredibly special. Having said that, I do appreciate the opportunity to speak with wonderful writers like both of you. And Sarah, coming from Montreal, that is one of the miracles of technology, of course, and something to appreciate, that accessibility and an ability to talk to people from far-flung places like Montreal. So I want to thank both of you for your wonderful readings and your discussion tonight. And I'm looking forward to both of your projects very much. And hopefully we can host you in the future in Calgary in person. We do have another online reading next month, December 9th. With Kyle Flemmer and Helen Hajnowski. So stay tuned check us out, Flywheel Reading Series on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you very much for coming tonight. And do check out these writers' books. So Because the Sun, I don't know if you can, it's probably backwards on your screen, and Because the Sun and Driven, The Secret Lives of Taxi Drivers. So Christmas is coming. The holidays. Do your shopping now. All right. Any final words, thoughts from anyone? I don't need to be the last person talking. All right. I want to say thank you and have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Yanni. It was great.